I get a couple of thumbs up. Are we seeing the screen? Just like, perfect. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Arianna Pikus. Thank you for that introduction. I will let Patti introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. So glad to be here. I'm Patti Bailie from University of Maine at Farmington. So, oh, and I'm starting, right, Arianna?
Yeah, yes.
Liza, thank you for that introduction. When you mentioned all the things I've done, I've been around a long time. So I've been in this field for 30 years, and after 30 years, I think you end up doing a lot. So that's probably why. But in my background, I did work at 3 different nature centers before coming to the university, where I've been here for 10 years. And at the one that you mentioned, I was the founding director of the Schlitz Audubon Nature Preschool. But the other 2 nature centers, I also worked in this field, early childhood environmental education, and was co-director of the Early Childhood Outdoors Institute in Omaha, Nebraska, at the nature center there. So I come from the field of environmental education, being a naturalist, and also education, because my master's is in elementary ed, but I also worked as a preschool teacher, and obviously at a nature preschool. And I absolutely love this field, and the fact that there are so many people now trying to integrate nature-based education into their programs, preschool programs, and even now in public schools. So Arianna and I are going to be talking about this new rating scale that we've developed, that's come out of a lot of different projects, and we'll talk a little bit, not so much about the history, but more about how to use it. So if you want to, I just tried to forward this the slide, Arianna. I forgot you have the control.
No problem. I've got that. No problem.
So what we're hoping to cover today, just briefly talk about the core principles of nature-based early childhood education, because I think it's really important to just touch on that when we're talking about high quality practices. Then we're going to do an overview of the NABERS, which is the what I used to call a Natureness scale, but it is the tool, the rating scales that we use to evaluate how much nature is in a program. And then we're going to go through some examples of how to use it. And hopefully by the time we've done all of that, it may answer some of your questions, but then we will definitely leave time at the end to answer questions that you have about how to use this tool. So, core principles of nature-based early childhood education. So this comes out of just working in this field for a long time, and out of some of the research that I did over 10 years ago, looking at what are those best practices in nature-based programs. And when I looked at this at that time, I was focused on licensed preschools at nature centers. So some of the items that are in the rating scale that we're going to be talking about really come from looking at these licensed programs at nature centers, and what kinds of practices do they have? What kind of education does the staff have? Do they spend time outdoors? So obviously one of the main things about nature-based education programs is they have an extensive daily outdoor time. That's a big part of it. They operate with nature as the curriculum's organizing concept. And so we'll be talking more about this later, but it's not just that you're in nature or you're learning about nature, but you're learning with nature. We follow a curriculum which emerges from children's interests in seasonal events. So very high quality early childhood education with an emergent curriculum. So as I mentioned, it emphasizes learning with nature rather than just learning in or about nature. And then learning crosses the boundaries of physical spaces. So it's not just indoors, and in some programs, they don't have an indoor space at all, but it's outdoors. And oftentimes in a preschool program, that's an area that is a fenced in space, but also in more wild spaces beyond that outdoor play space. So as Claire Warden calls it, the beyond. So inside, outside, and beyond. The one thing that is not mentioned on these core principles, but we'll talk about as being a very important piece of quality programs, is the background of the educators. You know, do they have an early childhood background and education? Do they have an environmental education background and education? So that's another important piece. Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a broad overview of the nature-based education rating scale, or what we call the NABERS. I'm not sure how many of you, where you are in your NABERS using process, but the purpose of this tool is really intended to identify high quality nature-based education practices. So that mix of like, where, if you think of kind of a Venn diagram, where high quality early childhood practices and like high quality nature-based or environmental education, where that overlaps, that's what this tool is designed to look at. So it's not just early childhood quality. We were very intentional about that. All of the items on the scale should only be applied within like a nature-based context. There's already plenty of tools that broadly look at early childhood quality overall, but we didn't want a program that doesn't really have nature to be able to score well on this tool, because it really is about how nature is integrated into practice. Like we said, there are two different tools. There is a pre-K version and then a K through third grade version, and we'll talk about some of the differences. But really, this tool was designed to capture a snapshot of the current nature-based early childhood education practices that are going on within a classroom, and also help identify potential areas for improvement within that classroom. It is meant to kind of be conducted over a half-day, kind of 3-hour observation within a single classroom. So if you're using it for self-evaluation, you can kind of think of your program and your classroom more holistically, but ideally it's kind of how many of these indicators are we meeting within kind of a half-day program or 3 hours. As I mentioned, there are two different tools, both the pre-K and the K through 3 version. They're very, very similar. However, while we were creating these, we did recognize that there were different like classrooms just look different in pre-K compared to K through 3 classrooms. Now, should they? That's a whole different topic, different day, different soapbox. But the reality is there's usually a lot more limitations and restrictions on elementary school classrooms, and there's some more flexibility in pre-K classrooms. So we recognize those different constraints while creating these tools. We also emphasize curriculum a little bit differently in both of the tools. So while we talk about curriculum in a more integrated way in the pre-K version, in the K through 3, we really look at how nature is integrated into different curriculum domains across the day. The tools both are organized by sections. We have 5 kind of overarching sections that we cover. First is the program structure, then staffing, the physical environment, community partnerships, and finally family engagement. Within each of those 5 sections, there are multiple categories. And then within the categories, there are multiple items. And each item is scored on a range of 1 to 5. So I'll show you, I realize this is a lot, but so if you look kind of up at the top is the section heading, followed by each different category. So, and then within each category are the different items, and each item can be scored on a scale from 1 to 7. And in addition to using this tool, we have some terms that we kind of incorporate throughout. Usually a 7 has a term of almost always, and this means every day or nearly every day, children are kind of present doing this activity. often we kind of categorize as more than 60% of the time. Sometimes is between 30 and 60% of the times. Rarely is less than 30%, and then does not happen. Pretty self-explanatory, doesn't happen. But that's usually kind of what, going back, is the difference between the different items. So 7 is usually almost always, often, a 3 is sometimes, and a 1 is does not occur. Okay, now we will go into the section highlights.
So I'm going to start talking about the first 3 sections. So the first section is about program structure. So in the program structure, we're talking about the goals of the program. So program goals. We're talking about program practices, what kinds of things go on. There's quite a few items under there. And then curriculum. And as Arianna mentioned, the curriculum piece for the pre-K is all about integrating everything into the curriculum, whereas in the K through 3, it's about the different areas of the curriculum, like math and science. So that's a little bit different. So when we talk about program goals, we're talking about the dual goals of both child development and environmental stewardship. So one thing that I found interesting when I did the research on these nature preschools that I visited, the 12 years ago or more, was that, you normally will have this child development goal if it's an early childhood program, but you rarely have the environmental stewardship goal. But if you're at a nature center, or it's not necessarily a nature preschool, but it's just a program at a nature center, the goals are generally environmental stewardship and conservation values and those kinds of things, but not necessarily child development. So what's really important about the combination between when you put those together and you have a nature preschool is that you should have goals for both. And depending on the education of the teachers or the directors, one is often not included. So let's go on to that next slide then, Arianna, and I'll talk about that one. So here's the section from the program goals piece. And the item is, it's program goals is A, program practices is B, and curriculum is C, those, that area. And then each one has item numbers. So this particular item number is item number 1. So it's program goals, section 1, and then A1. And the program has, this particular item is that the program has a mission or purpose statement that indicates dual goals of both child development and environmental stewardship. One of the things that we decided with this 1 through 7 rating is that we have 6, 4, and 2 in between that doesn't have a description, because when we use the scale, and the original one that I had come up with for the pre-K, which was a rating of 1 to 4, which was called the Natureness scale, you found yourself wanting to score in between 2 of the numbers. And instead of doing half numbers, it made more sense to just put numbers in between and not have a description, because they're not quite up to a 5, but they're not as low as a 3. 4, that would be perfect, right? So instead of 3.5 or whatever, we have that one in between.
And we'll talk about how to score at the end as well. So
Yes.
once we give you kind of a list of the items present, we'll talk about scoring at the end. We didn't want to overwhelm you with numbers just yet.
So go ahead to the next one, Arianna, and I'll talk about the example. So here's an example of a mission statement. It's actually, I believe it's the mission statement from Schlitz Audubon, but I'm not positive, or it could be from Chippewa. To provide a premier early childhood environmental education, which meets children's developmental needs while initiating them into a lifelong, meaningful relationship with the natural world. So to score a 7 on this one, it would be that the program has a mission or purpose statement that indicates both those dual goals of child development and environmental stewardship. which this mission statement does. It talks about children's development, and it also talks about initiating them into that lifelong meaningful relationship with the natural world. I put down 7 or 3. 3 has a mission statement that just indicates child development with no mention of nature. Obviously, this would be a 7. And so that's just a way to see, how would you score that? What I found is that I'm using this with actually my an intro to nature-based education class in our new certificate program that we have now at University of Maine at Farmington, graduate certificate program in nature-based education. And it was so interesting to have the students use this and say, I never even thought about a mission statement. I thought we were doing lots of nature, but we don't even have anything in there about environmental, stewardship or conservation values. And it's just almost like a wake-up call of, oh, I never even thought about that before. That makes sense. So go on to the next one, please.
So Patty, I think I figured out a way to give you control. So can you see if you can move it? If not, I'll move it for you.
All right. Yes, I think.
Perfect. Okay. I was like, I just found it. Yep. Wonderful.
Oh, did I go too far? I went too far. There we go. Oh, I can control it. Okay, I don't have to ask you anymore.
I'm glad I figured that out. Sorry, we didn't do that in prep, but now we've got this.
So I'm going to give an example now of the program practices. So obviously the program goals, there are items listed under there. Program practices, here's one of the items for program practices, and it has to do with starting the day outdoors. So one of the things that I found really important just in the work that I've done, or when I was teaching at a nature preschool or directing, was that when we started our day outdoors, if we weren't a program that stayed outdoors all the time, we had an indoor component. When we started our day outdoors, we spent more time outside. And it was a simple thing, but it made a lot of sense. And it put a priority on the outdoors by doing that. So that's why this is one of the items that's in here. And so this one has, again, this uses the almost always, often, sometimes, or does not as the ways to figure out which one you do. So here's an example of a teacher making a comment. We start our day outside unless the weather is dangerous, thunderstorms, extreme cold or heat. And so that would meet a level 7. The class almost always starts the day outdoors. But this is, if you're doing this and you're trying to figure out where you score, I'm giving you like snapshots and sometimes a photograph or sometimes, a statement, like the mission statement. Is that something that's posted? Is it in the parent manual? Is it in the staff manual? This might be a comment because you were talking to a teacher, or you might see a schedule that shows that the class starts outside. So there are different ways to figure out how do I know this information, and some is through an observation, some might be through an interview, depending on what you're looking at, or if you're self-evaluating, you're saying, do I do this? And then the last one in.
Oh, can I just interject real quickly,
yes,
Patty? I will say in the book, we do have at the end questions to ask for the interview portion of it and where to ask them as well. So there are guidelines for that if you are doing this at another center, or you're not using it for a self-evaluation.
So the last one that I'm going to talk about in this section are the curriculum items. And we put the pre-K and the K3 because they're different. They're very similar. So for the pre-K one, this particular one is about natural materials are used to teach curricular domains. And this is about teaching with nature, not just in or about nature. And for the K through 3, we just pulled out the math curriculum. So there's one for science, there's one for social studies. And in this one, it's about math materials. Almost always represent authentic local nature, and then they're aligned with seasonal happenings and consist of objects found in nature. So this is about using them for teaching those curriculum domains. And so it's a little bit different from the pre-K to the K3. So here's an example of some materials that they're wood cookies, tree cookies, that have, some animals and other objects, natural objects, leaves and things like that. And it's a matching game. So it's an example of natural materials being used. Now, looking at a photograph like this is not going to tell you if they're almost always used. But I just thought I would show a picture, and then you would have to do an observation, take a look at the classroom, see what kinds of materials are available, and observe if those are being used. So whether you would score a 7 on this, a 5, a 3, you do see natural materials, but how are they used? And this doesn't give you enough information to do that. But if we look at the difference between the pre-K and the K3 version, in section 1, some things that are different are having to do with how much time is spent outdoors. It has to do with regular visits to natural ecosystems, and how much daily class time is in unstructured nature play. And the reason for that is because in pre-K, you might be able to do more of this than you would in a public school that's K through 3. So that's why they're a little bit different. Also, we mentioned the curriculum is grouped in one category with the pre-K, and then 6 subcategories with the K through 3. Okay. So section 2, it has to do with staffing. And the staffing that we decided was important was the administrator's role, the teacher's role, teacher qualifications, and professional development. So I have a couple of examples, not for all 4 of these. I have one for teacher's role and professional development. But when we talk about the administrator's role, administrators in a pre-K program would be maybe the owner of the preschool, or it could be the director of the preschool. It could be a board that might be there. It could be, if you're in a public setting, it might be a principal. If you're in a K through 3 setting and it's a public school, then it most likely would be the principal, could be, superintendent, it could be the school board. So there's a lot of people that could count as administrators. But the most important part of the administrator's role is that they are supporting a nature-based approach. So are there resources being allocated by the administrators, whoever that ends up being in your system or in your program? Are they supportive of teacher training? Are they hiring teachers? And when they hire teachers, is this one of the questions they might ask on an interview, is about taking children outdoors, or what kind of experience do they have? Are they supporting the kinds of things that, materials that you would want to have in a program? So that's the administrator's role. When we talk about the teacher's role, there's a number of different things. I'll give you an example of one of them, but it is really about the teacher facilitating the learning in nature and conveying a positive attitude about being outdoors. When we talk about qualifications, it does vary by, whether it's the pre-K program or a public school. You're talking about what kind of education. Do they have a degree in early childhood education and environmental education, or do they have some kind of nature-based education training? Maybe they've got, a degree in environmental education, not in early childhood education. One of the things that I did when I started the preschool in Wisconsin is I would hire an environmental educator and an early childhood educator to be co-teachers in the classroom, so that they worked with each other and learned from each other and supported both ends of this. Nowadays, maybe do they have the certificate in, like the Antioch nature-based certificate, or a graduate certificate in nature-based education, or something like that. So the qualifications, you're also looking for certified teachers if you're in a public school program. And then professional development has to do with that ongoing professional development to facilitate the teacher's interest in skills and knowledge of nature and nature-based education pedagogy. So it's not just, learning about natural history, which is a part of it, but it's also about the types of pedagogy you need in order to take children outdoors. So they're kind of both there. And how often do they do those kinds of professional development, like what you're doing right now? This is professional development. So this first one, the teacher's role, is from section 2 and then B1. This item 1 is teachers facilitate open-ended nature exploration and play. So what the example, let me find the example. Okay. So teachers almost always facilitate open-ended nature exploration and play during outdoor time, or maybe they often do sometimes. So it varies depending on how often, they do it. But it's also about, what kinds of things do they do? What did you observe? So the teacher here is this one right here on the ground. I don't know if you can see him. And it really makes a difference in getting down on the ground with the children. Really facilitated this play. I did this observation. This is one of the pieces I did at the Chippewa Nature Preschool in Chippewa, Michigan. And I got to follow them around and go on a hike with them. And I saw wonderful facilitation of that open-ended nature exploration and play by the teacher. So they would have gotten a 7 on this. And the other one that I wanted to talk about in this section is professional development. So this has to do with teachers participating in professional development to improve their skills and knowledge of nature-based education. And as I mentioned, it's about cultivating their own interest in this and how often they do it. So it might be twice a year to get a 7, once a year to get a 5, and also has to do with it being related to both nature-based education pedagogy and natural history knowledge. If it's only one of those, then you might be a 3. And if you only did it once a year type of thing. So so the idea is to get people thinking about, what kind of professional development are they doing? Are they visiting model programs? Are they attending workshops? What kind of knowledge and skills are they acquiring? So an example here is that teachers report that they attend some sort of professional development each summer. So it's once a year related to natural history topics. So they're not doing pedagogy. They're just doing more about the knowledge of natural history. So that might not get a 7, and that maybe would get a 3 because they're not doing both. So that's the idea. I think one of the things that we have to be really careful about with this is one of the things I noticed with my students was they're like, I thought I did a whole lot of more nature than what I'm seeing in the scale. But then what they realized was, no, it's not about you being graded. It's about what could you do more of? What is this making you aware of that you weren't aware of before? And I think that's an important piece that we need to make sure that people aren't feeling bad about what they're doing. They should feel good about what they're doing and what else can they do that they never thought about before or might have been missing. So when we look at the section differences for section 2 between pre-K and K3 is that the pre-K, the staff includes both the teachers and the administrators, whereas in the K3, the teachers mean just the direct instructional staff. So it's a little different depending on which one you're in, because administrators wouldn't necessarily be teaching, but oftentimes they are in a pre-K program. So it would just vary on what your program does. And the last section that I want to focus on is the environment. So we thought it was really important to talk about all 3 areas that you might be in, depending on what kind of program you have. So we included the indoor classroom, the natural play area outside, which might be a fenced-in area, and then the natural ecosystems that are beyond the fence. And we realized that there are programs that would only be outdoors. They may do everything outdoors, like a forest kindergarten, forest preschool. So we do have one item in there that is for people that are only outdoors. And all it's asking for is, do you have an indoor space for inclement weather? But if you do have an indoor space where children are spending time, we feel like it needs to be infused with lots of natural light and natural wood and materials, animals and plants. For an outdoor area, it would include a lot of different natural features, loose parts, maybe some man-made loose parts, and maybe some natural loose parts, but mostly natural. And then the variety of features that you'd see in a natural base player, and how many of each do you have would give you a different score. And then the natural ecosystems, or the beyond the fence, are really how many of different kinds of natural ecosystems do you have? Do you have a woods and a pond and a prairie or gardens? It's really about how often and how many of those you might find. I think the how often is more in our program practices, how often you visit those areas. So examples of these. So one example of an item in the indoor classroom are that natural materials are present and reflect the local nature. So, oftentimes we, don't have things that are from local areas, and we want this to be something where children are, it's more of a place-based approach. So what are those natural areas, natural materials that might be in a classroom? So for example, the natural materials, might be, we were at a nature center. So when I say bird parts, we used to have these ones we called birds on a stick, which were just stuffed birds, and they were on a stick, and that was in the collections that we had at the nature center that we would bring out for the children to see. Animal bones, bird nests, tree seeds, all kinds of things that you can have out are present in all areas of the indoor classroom and reflect a variety of local nature, versus that maybe they're in some areas, or maybe you don't have any at all. The picture on the top here was from the nature preschool in Wisconsin, and you can see lots of natural materials, reflections of nature in the rugs and in the pillows, and on the left there are a lot of nature books. Here are some other pictures of some possible things that might be in the classroom. So obviously you'd score higher the more that you have in there, but it really gets you looking at, what is in the classroom, and how do I have this in different areas of the classroom. This natural play area section includes where the natural play area contains a variety of natural features. So those features could be gardens and sand and soil and water feature, and places for active play with loose parts, and lots of different things that could be part of it, and how many you have. So when we talk about getting a 7, it's that the natural play area at least includes at least 7 areas of those kinds of natural features, whereas 5 is 5 of those areas, and 3 is 3 of those areas, and of course 1 means it's just a traditional playground and doesn't have them. So an example here, all 3, 5, and 7 all have some natural features, whereas 1 doesn't. And this was a actual playground at a high quality not a nature preschool, but preschool program that had this wooded area in the back that they never used, but had this little play structure there. So, I wouldn't give it as high of a score if that's all they were using. If they're using, and there weren't really any logs or things to climb on and things like that. So you start looking at it and thinking, okay, how does this score for that? The last one is about the natural ecosystems. So scoring, a higher number would mean that you have at least 3 different ecosystems that you can visit at different times. So a pond, a river, a wetland, a marsh, a meadow, field, prairie, woods, etc. Scoring 5 would mean you'd have 2, and scoring 3 would be that maybe there's, that woods that you saw behind the that play structure, maybe if they do visit it, then that's one area that's more of a natural wild area, or you have no access. So this one is a picture of a nature preschool in the Cleveland area that is at their metro parks. Their indoor space that they hardly ever use is just tiny and doesn't really have a lot in it, but their outdoor space was phenomenal. And they had a fenced in area that had a pond and some gardens and other things. And then when they went beyond the fence, there was this wooded area. There were were more gardens, and they did have access to a pond. So they definitely had those ecosystems that they visited on a regular basis and really spent most of their time outdoors. And there really were no differences between the pre-K and the K3 versions on the environments.
Wonderful. Thanks, Patty. I'm gonna take over and chat about the last 2 sections of these tools. So section 4 is looking at community partnerships and resources available. So within this section, there are 3 categories. The first is the nature educator. So does an experienced educator come to the classroom regularly, and are they developing an ongoing relationship with not only the teacher, but the children in the classroom as well? The next category is looking at artifacts and resources on site. So what resources are available on the school property that classrooms can access to support the ongoing nature-based curriculum? And then finally, special programs or field trips. So what types of field trips does the nature-based classroom go on, if any? And how are those field trips integrated into the ongoing curriculum? And I'll give examples of each of these. Okay, so first within nature educator, it's like the first item we have is the nature educator visits frequently. So how, like I said, how often is that nature educator coming? Is it at least once a week, which would be evidence of a 7? Or is it more once a month, which would be evidence of a 5, seasonally, which is a 3, or once a year or less, which would be a 1? And then again, the same time, how, what is that relationship like between the nature educator and the classroom? Is it just a different person comes every time, and so there really isn't a relationship? Or is it the same nature educator who is kind of always coming to the program? So an example of this through kind of one interview question, a teacher might say, oh, one of the nature center staff leads us on a hike each week. It's usually either Kate or Maurice. So kind of within this interview, this is giving evidence that the nature educator is visiting at least once a week to take them on a hike. And it's also evidence of our second item, which it's either Kate or Maurice. So we know them by name. They know some of our children's names. Again, developing this relationship. Looking at category B and item 2. So again, this is what artifacts or resources are available to support the nature-based curriculum. This item is looking at what wild or domestic animals are available to support nature-based learning. So are there animals available that children can view again as part of that ongoing curriculum? Or is that not on site? So here's an example of a raptor center at a preschool that's part of a nature center. Again, so this might be on property. You'd think that the class can regularly access it as they want to, or as it's appropriate, or as they're talking about different raptors. But through an interview, we found that although we do have raptors on site, because it's a nature center and there's a big public interest, we really need to schedule time pretty far in advance to see them. So this would be a instead of kind of this almost always available. So while like a level 7 is, it's there on property, they can access it kind of anytime they want to or within reason. This is probably more evidence of a level 5. So it's there, they can access it, but they have to plan pretty far in advance. So if anyone who works with young children, sometimes, you know, we're kind of missing that emergent curriculum piece. If everyone's really excited, or we're talking about something in the curriculum right now, about raptors, but we can't go see them for 2 more weeks, that's more evidence of a 5, or maybe even a 3, depending on how much access they can have to it. And then finally, for field trips, so for here, the item is the program attends a nature-based field trip that are then integrated into the curriculum. So a 7 shows that they attend, you know, a nature-based special field trip that is away from the school at least 2 times a year. And these experiences are then integrated into the ongoing curriculum. A 5 is once a year, and again, integrated into the curriculum. 3 is they may go on nature-based field trips, but they're really not connected to the ongoing curriculum. So they might do something like, you know, we go to the apple orchard in the fall, but that was just kind of a one-off special thing we did. We're not talking about it in the class. And then a 1 is no nature field trips. So this kind of comes the way, you know, if you're in a classroom, you might see evidence of a field trip. Sometimes there's pictures around the classroom, or boards, or things, different things around the classroom showing that they went on a field trip. But usually, to kind of get at this item, you, if you're self-examining, it's obviously reflection, but if you're working with another teacher, some questions to ask have you gone on any field trips this year? Where have you gone? Or do you have any planned? Where are you going to go? How do you prepare for the field trips? And so this will kind of give you some idea of how this field trip is being kind of integrated into the curriculum before they go on the field trip. And then what, if any, follow-up activities do you have planned that are related to the field trip? That's how are you kind of debriefing that experience, and again, integrating it within the ongoing curriculum. So again, for example, if a classroom went to an apple orchard, but they did it kind of just on their own, and wasn't, there was really kind of no setting the stage for it before they went, or integration after that experience, that would be example of a 3. However, if the classroom has been talking about, I don't know, different farm animals, and kind of talking about that as part of the curriculum beforehand, they go and visit a local farm, and then they do some activities after. That would be evidence of a 7 or a 5, depending on how many field trips they go on that year. And within this section, there are no differences between the pre-K and the K through 3 version. And finally, our last section is looking at family engagement. So how are families communicated with about the benefits and the outcomes of the nature-based experience? What types of family nature experiences are being offered so that the families have opportunities to experience nature together? And how are families involved in the ongoing nature-based classroom activities? So for family communication and education, the first item is looking at how does the program share nature-related content with families through formal means of communication? So this can be things like how is nature talked about in the family handbook, in family orientation, in a newsletter, or in different reports of classroom activities, or for example, even in family and teacher conferences. So here's an example of, this first example is clothing dressing for success. This is part of one program's handbook, which all families get if they enroll in this program. It talks about we're going outside every day. Children need to be dressed appropriate. Here's what they need to participate. We have kind of an example of different activities that are then shared with the family, or as part of the family teacher conference that's held once a year or once every kind of semester. How are we talking about a child's connection with nature? So kind of all of these little bits of evidence show us that nature-related content is being embedded into multiple areas of communication for families. Our next item is dealing with family nature experiences. So does the program offer nature-based family programs, and how many? So again, a 7 is they offer 3 seasonal nature-based programs are offered at least yearly. 5 is a 2, 3 is a 1, and then 1 is no nature-based family programs. And this really lets families kind of cultivate their positive experiences and enjoyment with nature. Not only is the child having these experiences, but the family is as well. And then finally, our last category here is family involvement. And one of the items here is that the program encourages family volunteers to participate in nature-based classroom activities. So our families, almost always encouraged to participate in the ongoing nature-based classroom activities, or sometimes or not at all. These are things that you can kind of gather by asking and having conversation during that interview portion with the instructor. Or you might see during an observation, like a specific parent volunteer sheet specifically for nature-based activities. So parents are able to sign up and kind of say what they want to help with. And again, in this section, there are no differences between the pre-K and the K-3 version. I'm mindful of time and I want to make sure we have time to answer questions, but I will just very briefly go over how these items are scored. So within both the pre-K and the K-3 version, there is a summary sheet, which you can fill out, and scores for each category go kind of to the left on that line. You total those scores and then you average them for every section. Again, this is a close-up of kind of the information if you're going to visit another center. And then again, we average all the classroom scores to get a total. As Patti mentioned, we do have kind of, someone can score between a 1 and a 7 on each of these items. Sometimes, it's very clearly a 7 if they've got all 7s. That's what you give the category overall, but it gets kind of tricky depending on how many items there are. So if categories have 3 or more items within the book, we provide guidance on how to grade those. So, if a category, so say kind of the outdoor play area, it's got a lot of 7s, but then it's got 1 in those items, they're not able to earn a 6. So they need to, it's probably going to be a level 5. But so it just kind of helps you if there's 3 or more items. We also provide guidance within the book on if the category only contains 2 items. So how do you score that category overall? And then also if a category only has 1 item, you just score that item. That one's pretty self-explanatory. And there's a couple of sections that have that. There's a couple of sections and categories in both the pre-K and the K-3 version. Okay, we will now open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Arianna and Patti. That was really wonderful and super helpful. So now you're welcome to unmute yourself or put your questions in the chat box, and then we have a little time for Patti and Arianna to answer your questions.
I'm gonna just go to the next slide that has our contact information, and then we'll stop sharing so we can all be. And this includes Rachel.
Yeah, we want to acknowledge that Rachel Larimore was instrumental in this work as well. So there's her contact information if you were interested.
Leave it up for a minute and then maybe we'll just stop sharing.
I had a question. Hi, I'm Manzi. I'm in Brattleboro, Vermont, and I just have like a family childcare that's nature-based. And thank you so much for your presentation and for putting together this book. I can tell you all worked really hard on it, and it's given me a lot to think about. Definitely super helpful. And yeah, one question I guess I had was, I'm new at having my own program, and so I'm wondering if you are aware of a similar assessment tool that's for nature-based education, specifically preschool, pre-K, early childhood, that's for assessing the development of the children in that program, because it is a bit different than a lot of the developmental assessments are geared towards an indoor classroom space with just blocks that you stack or whatever. So I was just curious if maybe I haven't like researched it a lot on my own, but if you know of any.
So you're talking about
like child specific outcomes, correct? For nature-based.
We came out with a book last year called Partnering with Nature in Early Childhood, which is the curriculum of the Schlitz Audubon Nature Preschool of 20 years worth of putting a curriculum together with the teachers. And I was the founding director for the first 9 or 10 years, and then the director who was there a year ago, and I published this through Griffin House, came out last November. And one of the features of it is an assessment piece. So it's done as a continuum, but what we did was we put together what we called intentions rather than standards. And these intentions were based on the Wisconsin early learning standards, which are very similar to what most states have. But we added things that we felt were missing. So it has social and emotional and physical cognitive development, but it also has environmental awareness. It has a piece about risk. It has another piece about community, spiritual development, and all of them tied to nature and nature-based education. And the assessment piece is based on those intentions. So that's the only one I can think of offhand. It doesn't mean there aren't other ones out there, but that's a relatively new one that just came out last year. Is that kind of what you're asking for?
Totally. That's super helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay. And
yeah, I would say that's probably the most kind of comprehensive out there. What a lot of programs have had to do is look at kind of their state standards and kind of adapt it to their own program. Yeah, I don't know of, I mean, beyond, kind of that guiding, there's not really anything else that I'm familiar with that's not like a program specific.
So many of us in this field have put these together ourselves. So the link to it is called Partnering with Nature in Early Childhood, a Guide to Outdoor Experiences. Liza put that in the chat. But, you know, another tool that like Claire Warden in Scotland has put together is something called Floor Books, where it's about documentation and taking pictures and working with the children to put these floor books together. I think that's probably another potential way of doing assessment with young children in nature-based programs. You can find her information by Googling Claire Warden or looking up Mind Stretchers, which is the company that she owns, and look for floor books. She has a book about it called Floor Books. Actually, we are doing a travel course from my university next May to Scotland, and we are going to be visiting Claire's nature kindergarten. And one of the days that we're going to have with her is going to be a workshop on floor books. So I'm going to learn a lot more about it. I kind of know it, but my students are going to get a chance to participate in that with Claire.
And there's one question in the chat box from Kelsey wondering about the difference between making observations in different seasons. So winter versus warmer months, warmer seasons, and how what Kelsey's saying is that perhaps their program would score differently, and just wondering about that.
That's a really good question. I don't know. Arianna, have we thought about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've thought about it broadly, and if you're thinking about I think most of the items should apply regardless of season. And when we're talking about kind of like going outside and the amount, obviously that, you know, depends on different restrictions. You know, if it's below freezing and not safe to take children out, or, you know, I recently moved to Texas and there are times where it is too hot to take children out longer than 5 minutes, if that. So there is some guidance in the book about, you know, obviously, you know, to the extent that you can take them out, that is safe to do. And yeah, if you're kind of looking at your own like program, I mean, just because it's winter doesn't mean that you're not talking about nature in the curriculum. And so there's kind of different areas. I would say there's probably a couple items that it might impact, but overall, I don't think it should. What do you think, Patti?
Well, no, yeah, and I'm thinking about that too. Is that we want to encourage people to take children outside. Unfortunately, what happens is some school districts and programs set these arbitrary temperatures that maybe you could take children out when it's colder than that if they're dressed appropriately, but it has to, you know, that has a lot to do with it. And maybe you look at this in different seasons and see, you know, how it varies, but that doesn't mean you're not going to rate high on there because you're taking children out a lot. And that's actually kind of building off that, like a place to grow of, oh, we spend a lot of time outside in this fall and spring and summer, but then winter we don't. And so it's what can you do to kind of grow in that area. And again, sometimes there are big restrictions, but also sometimes it's just a comfortability, or it's not having the right gear, or thinking about what to do in those types of places. Do you want to unshare the
stop sharing the screen? Absolutely.
Yeah, just thought of that.
What other questions do people have for us?
I'm glad you put that link in, Liza, about winter resources, because that's a really important piece.
And we've done some webinars. Actually, there are probably a lot of webinars out there right now that you could watch or listen to that'll give you ideas for how to take children outdoors in winter safely, how to access the gear and that kind of thing. So I'll put that in the chat box too.
Yeah, that's right. I think, yeah, now in Texas and different places kind of in the southeast are having different issues of how do we still incorporate nature in the warmer months compared, they're like winter, we can go outside anytime. Summer though, how do we do this in a safe way?
Well, I had one more question.
Yeah.
If that's okay. There was that section on having like a naturalist come to your program ideally once a week and like lead a hike. Is that still feel like required even if your teachers have like training as naturalists, or is that more geared towards a program that's just like more ECE or something?
Yeah, so broadly, again, we are pretty broad on what constitutes a nature educator. So again, if someone in your program has formal training, you know, so it can look a little bit different. It can look like somebody from the community coming to help kind of support the ongoing nature-based education. Sometimes it's, you know, if the teacher has their own expertise in that area, it can count. It can be like if an administrator is trained in environmental education and they're doing something with a classroom once a week, that is counts. Or sometimes some programs have like a special person, which we're seeing more of. So like this is the nature-based person, so they do something with each class once a week. As well, you know, you kind of have a literacy coach, you might have a nature-based person on site, which we were seeing in some of the like elementary school programs. So it just kind of depends, but it's pretty broad on what that person, but we want to make sure that nature-based expertise is coming in addition to the pedagogy.
Tell you where that came from initially was from the research I did at nature centers with nature-based preschools, you know, licensed preschools at nature centers. It was so interesting to go to these places that had extensive resources that were not being used with the children. So you had naturalists that worked at the nature center. You had, but the one in particular I remember was the beautiful nature center, but the classrooms were just stark and awful, and the teachers were elementary public school teachers that didn't really have early childhood background or a nature-based background. And I think that the director of the nature center hired them thinking they would know what to do. I don't know why, but they didn't. I mean, I don't know why she did that because they really didn't. And I visited their program once, and it was a beautiful day outside, and they went out for 5 minutes at the end of the day because that's all they had time for, because they were doing all this indoor stuff that was really worthless stuff, I have to say. And it scared me to see that a place that had those resources did not take advantage of it. And I did ask them, do you have naturalists that come in and work with your children and your classes? And they said, oh no, they can't do that. They don't have time to do that. So that's where that started. So yes, I think that we need to look at it as, you know, what are the resources you have? And I like the way that you explained it, Arianna. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think we give a couple more examples in the book. Like, you know, it could also be a child's family member offering that expertise, but yeah. There's a couple more that I'm blanking on right now, but there's some guidance from that in the book.
And I just want to be mindful of the time. It's after 6 o'clock. And if anyone has a last, you know, burning question that you want to make sure to get in, I think we can take one more question.